objectives of Quad is entirely different from that of NATO.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas Tokyo edition. I'm Palki Sharma and we're coming to you live from the capital city of Japan. It's our fourth day in the city, and what a day it's been. Today, Tokyo hosted the second in-person Quad Leaders Summit. It was attended by India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Australia's newly elected Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, US President Joe Biden, and the leader of the host nation, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. As these leaders came together for the Quad Summit in Tokyo, China and Russia came together for joint drills over the Sea of Japan. We've been up since dawn, bringing you minute-by-minute developments, putting together some very interesting stories for you as well, and speaking to some very influential people. On the show tonight, we have an exclusive interview with the original architect of the Quad, Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. That's followed by a breakdown of what this summit was all about, the highlights, the big takeaways, the hits and misses, and the big bilaterals. Coming up is the biggest geopolitical story from an Indian perspective, direct from Tokyo. I'm Palki Sharma and this is Gravitas Tokyo edition. We begin with a Gravitas exclusive. For most of the century, Shinzo Abe has dominated Japan's politics. He's the longest-serving prime minister in this country's history. Abe's contributions are many, but the one that stands out is perhaps the creation of Quad. He first spelled out the vision of the Quad at the Indian Parliament in 2007. Shinzo Abe has since shaped this alliance. He led a diplomatic initiative to elevate the status of the Quad. He made it a real forum for leaders to gather to discuss the challenges in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So what does Shinzo Abe, the man and the mind behind the Quad, think of the grouping today? Has the Quad lived up to his vision? Has it delivered on its promises? Why are Quad leaders reluctant to name China? Will the Quad have to deal with the Chinese invasion of Taiwan? Is Beijing's threat of taking Taiwan by force a serious one, or is it just posturing? Yesterday, Joe Biden said the US will defend Taiwan militarily. What does Shinzo Abe think of that? Earlier today, I put all these questions to Mr. Abe himself. Here's an excerpt from that conversation. Mr. Abe, welcome to WION.
Yeah, so I've been looking forward to this, production. I'm very happy to be on the show.
Today's newspapers in Japan, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, talk about US President Joe Biden reaffirming his commitment to defending Taiwan, only for the White House to immediately clarify that their policy on Taiwan remains unchanged. Do you believe that the US will militarily intervene if China were to invade Taiwan?
Well, I think his comment was intentionally made, but you must forget the fact that he has in the past also made a similar comment that U.S. will be, willing to fully defend Taiwan if China were to militarily invade Taiwan. So that's on the very ground of staying strategically ambiguous in terms of policy. And on the very point that the White House came right out saying, our policy of, staying ambiguous strategically has not changed. The fact that they clarified that right after President Biden's comment actually gives us a signal that the U.S. is starting to look at the change of the policy there. And I have been an advocate of changing this ambiguous strategy. At the time when U.S. took this ambiguous strategy, there was a huge gap of military power between U.S. and China. But as we see China closing that gap very rapidly with a very strong military power that they're building up, it's dangerous to keep this policy in place. So I would, in consequence, welcome President Biden's comment. His comment flatly would signal a change of that ambiguous strategic policy when it comes to China-Taiwan relationship.
戦略を維持することは危険だというふうに私は思います。
So let me understand this correctly. You're saying that with yesterday's statement, no matter what the White House has said in clarification, you believe that there is a shift in American policy vis-a-vis Taiwan?
中国に対してのメッセージなんですが、
This is actually a comment given directly from President Biden, and he talked about U.S.'s full commitment to defend Taiwan, even though the White House came out and denied, any overreaction to that, saying that it's the same policy. But I think essentially what President Biden had said shows the truth, and it was a message to China.
Very interesting. Do you believe that Xi Jinping is going to attack Taiwan and take it by force?
Of course, Xi Jinping's policy of one China is out and clear, as it had been stated, and they have clearly shown that forceful action by force is one of the options that they might actually exercise. But if U.S. were to clearly be in a position to interfere with such action of military invasion by China, I think China would consequently have to give up the idea, because China certainly doesn't want to go into war with U.S.
So what do you think the Chinese military is trying to do as they surround Taiwan, as they, satellite images have come out of them taking out certain targets? Do you think this is a pressure tactic? Do you think that the Chinese president is preparing to mount some sort of an invasion while the world remains distracted with Ukraine, with supply chain disruptions, with economic pressures?
中国にとってベストなのはですね。
Well, what would be best scenario for China's perspective, of course, is for Taiwan to voluntarily become part of China, but such is not likely to occur. There are a couple of stories I can think of when it comes to how China would make happen one China story. For example, China could be on a very forefront of trying to have an influence over Taiwan as it makes Taiwan's situation unstable when it comes to political activities or economic activities. However, on that very point, I must not forget to mention that the current administration in Taiwan is a popular administration. There is quite a bit of stability when it comes to politics and economy. But, things might happen, and when that change comes, that would be a window of opportunity, I think, from the perspective of China. There is a great deal of influence over Taiwan from China, of course, as you know, economically and also in terms of media control.
When you say things might happen, are you suggesting that China might engineer political instability in Taiwan, and that would be the route that they would prefer?
様々な可能性があると思います。
There are various possibilities. The fact that China and Taiwan speak the same language, economically they are relying on each other. There's quite a bit of going back and forth between the two countries that gives us a lot of touch points where things could possibly change. And the situation is different from the Ukraine situation.
Let's talk about your relationship with India and Prime Minister Modi. How do you describe it?
Of course, we had to stop diplomatic visits during the COVID pandemic for 2 years, but you can see the historical visits that we've made back and forth. Of course, I was very energetic when it comes to strengthening the bilateral relationship during my second administration, but I would go back as far as my first administration, where I visited India and I gave a parliamentary speech, and I talked about the two seas being united. This became really the concept that led to the Quad and economic collaborations thus after that we have elaborated on. I have always been saying that this bilateral relationship between Japan and India is the type of bilateral relationship that has the biggest potential of all. And we are actually starting to see all the fruit of the relationship. So I'm actually going to step up as the president of Japan, or Japan-Indo Association, taking the position of formerly served by Yoshio Mori. It has a history of 120 years. It's actually longer than US-Japan, Japan-US Association.
You've also had a long association with Mr. Modi in particular, and you've known him since the time that he was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. Can you tell us about your engagements and interactions with him? And I ask this because when two leaders meet, there's a lot of talk about personal chemistry. How much does personal chemistry, how big a role does it play in international diplomacy?
We've spent quite a bit of time, talking, doing other matters around our diplomatic activities. So relationship goes deep. Our understanding towards national security, the world issues that we need to all collaborate, solve together, are very much, united. And I respect Prime Minister Modi for the fact that he's a quick decision maker. He has that power to make things happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
15 years ago, Shinzo Abe had advocated for a rules-based Indo-Pacific. This was during his historic address to the Indian Parliament. The Quad has since come a long way. Today, Tokyo hosted the second ever Quad Leaders' Summit, the second ever in-person summit. How did it go? Let me show you.
Prime Minister Albanese, I welcome you to your first Quad meeting. Like I said, you got on a plane, you were sworn in, got in a plane, and if you fall asleep while you're here, it's okay. Because I don't know how you're doing it. But
the new Australian government's priorities align with the Quad agenda.
क्वाड इंडो पैसिफिक क्षेत्र के लिए एक कंस्ट्रक्टिव एजेंडा लेकर चल रहा है। इससे क्वाड की छवि एक फोर्स फॉर गुड के रूप में और भी सुदृढ़ होती जाएगी।
It is extremely important for us to show a strong commitment to the shared vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific to the international society.
This is what the Quad looks like today. A seasoned leader, a jet-lagged Prime Minister eager to take the alliance forward, a leader preoccupied by tensions at home, perhaps even facing a midterm election setback, and a Prime Minister sincerely carrying the legacy of his predecessor. This is the grouping of the world's biggest democracies. They share some common waters and a common concern. It's called China. So what did the Quad achieve in its fourth big meeting in less than 2 years? Tonight, we sum it up in 4 highlights. Number 1 is China, of course. This year too, China did not find a direct mention in the summit, in the joint statement. Perhaps Quad believes in signaling, not naming. This summit, for example, was headlined by the launch of a satellite system, a system designed to track illegal fishing in the high seas. Or should I say, Chinese illegal fishing. So here we have clear action aimed at China without naming China. We'll discuss this in detail in a bit. Let me come to highlight number 2, India's vaccine diplomacy and pandemic response. It drew praise from all leaders involved. The Quad lauded India's leadership and solutions to the global problem. Sources also tell us that Joe Biden contrasted India's success in handling the Wuhan virus with China's failure to control this homemade pandemic. Biden said, Prime Minister Modi's success has shown the world that democracies can deliver. Sources also tell us that Anthony Albanese, the Australian leader, told Prime Minister Modi that vaccines exported by India made a difference on the ground. Prime Minister Kishida of Japan also praised India's vaccine Maitri. India's Prime Minister Modi is currently the senior-most Quad leader. He's been in office for 8 years. That's almost half of the Quad's lifetime. The Prime Minister has seen this alliance grow, and he's best positioned to assess the group's progress. Today, he told his fellow leaders that the Quad scope has become extensive and its form effective.
कोविड-19 की विपरीत परिस्थितियों के बावजूद हमने वैक्सीन डिलीवरी, क्लाइमेट एक्शन, सप्लाई चेन रेजिलियंस, डिजास्टर रिस्पांस और आर्थिक सहयोग जैसे कई क्षेत्रों में आपसी समन्वय बढ़ाया है। इससे इंडो पैसिफिक में शांति, समृद्धि और स्थिरता सुनिश्चित हो रही है।
A lot of convergence, but on Russia and Ukraine, The leaders are not on the same page. US President Joe Biden used the forum to sell America's narrative. He once again insisted that the war in Europe is everybody's business. Japan's Fumio Kishida said that the Quad should not let a similar invasion happen in the Indo-Pacific, which is a clear reference to China's dream project, the invasion of Taiwan.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine clearly challenges the principles written in the Charter of the United Nations. We cannot let the same thing happen in the Indo-Pacific region.
And this is more than just a European issue. It's a global issue.
Remember, India has refused to join the US-led sanctions against Russia. India also continues to buy Russian oil despite American pressure. And at the Quad summit today, India's challenge was to ensure that Ukraine does not hijack the agenda. The press here has some interesting observations on this. It says India prizes its non-aligned status, that India can only be a partner, not an ally. Perhaps the realization has dawned on India's Quad partners. Now we move to highlight number 4. Which was a Quad leader himself, the new Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, 59 years old, elected to office on Sunday. He took oath of office almost immediately and was in Tokyo on Monday, just so that he could attend the Quad summit in person. Well, it says a lot about Albanese's commitment to Quad. So what does Albanese bring to the table? Years of experience, also a deep understanding of the Indo-Pacific. He has served as the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. He has taken the baton from an administration that has been remarkably tough on China. Remember, Australia called for a probe into the source of the Wuhan virus. They also slammed Beijing's security deal with the Solomon Islands. This was under Scott Morrison. You see, China's expansionist moves are inching closer to Australia, and the Quad may be Albanese's best bet to counter it.
And as we gather today, I acknowledge all that the Quad has achieved, standing together for a free, open and resilient Indo-Pacific region, and working together to tackle the biggest challenges of our time, including climate change and the security of our region. My government is committed to working with your countries, and we are committed to the Quad.
In fact, I have the joint statement with me. Allow me to quote a few lines from what it says. This is the Quad joint statement, and I'm quoting: "We will champion adherence to international law, particularly as reflected in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the maintenance of freedom of navigation and overflight to meet challenges to the maritime rules-based order, including in the East and South China Seas. We strongly oppose coercive, provocative, or unilateral actions that seek to change the status quo and increase tensions in the area, such as the militarization of disputed features, the dangerous use of Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia, and efforts to disrupt other countries' offshore resource exploitation activities," not naming China, but sending a direct message to China. So that's enough and more references to China, like I said, without directly naming it. This is signaling at its best. There's also a very interesting reference to another country. Let me read it out for you. "We denounce the use of terrorist proxies," guess which one this is, "and emphasize the importance of denying any logistical, financial or military support to terrorist groups which could be used to launch or plan terror attacks, including cross-border attacks. We reiterate our condemnation of terrorist attacks, including 26/11 Mumbai and Pathankot attacks." If you're thinking Pakistan, you're right. The statement also mentions the Quad Fellowship. It mentions Myanmar, climate, technology, cybersecurity, space, infrastructure. The scope is vast. But could the Quad have set more precise security goals, perhaps lay out a clearer roadmap for an open, free and inclusive Indo-Pacific that the leaders keep talking about endlessly? It could have. Could the leaders have addressed the skepticism around the Quad vis-a-vis the AUKUS? They could have. The Japanese Prime Minister said they're not looking to join the AUKUS, but they want a closer security partnership with Australia. Has China reacted to this joint statement yet? It hasn't. But its fighter jets have carried out sorties over the Sea of Japan, also the East China Sea. What's more, these Chinese jets were joined by Russian fighters, and these joint flights corresponded with the Quad summit, a 13-hour-long operation according to some reports, and that's signaling again for you. Signals of clear security alliances being drawn here. For now, like they say, all's well that ends well. The Quad ended on a good note, an in-person meeting in the middle of a war, an in-person meeting at the heels of a change of guard, in the middle of a pandemic, in China's backyard, and despite clear and stated differences on Russia. It only underlines the Quad's commitment to the alliance. These 4 countries have signaled that the Quad is not a fad, as Joe Biden put it, and it's a force for good, as the Indian Prime Minister said. The Quad summit may have been the highlight of Prime Minister Modi's visit, but it wasn't the only thing on the agenda. An array of bilaterals was also held today. The first one was the Modi-Biden meeting. It was held immediately after the Quad summit. Why is this important? Because this was the first in-person meeting after Russia invaded Ukraine. India's policy on this has been at odds with the American agenda, and we all know that. In fact, Biden called India's stand somewhat shaky. That's how he put it. White House officials began preaching India on where it will find itself in history books. There were warnings of significant and long-term consequences. We've reported all of this on the show. India did not give in. 4 months on, Washington seems to have agreed to disagree with India. This was amply evident in the Modi-Biden bilateral today. The US president did bring up Ukraine and the impact of Russia's actions, but refrained from drawing India in. Listen to this.
We also discussed the ongoing effects of Russia's brutal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine and the effect it has on the entire global world order. And the U.S. and India are going to continue consulting closely on how to mitigate these negative effects.
The 2 leaders also talked about vaccines. Biden announced the renewal of the Indo-US Vaccine Action Program, a 35-year-old bilateral program aimed at fighting infectious diseases. Now, they're going to renew it for another 5 years. The India-USA Incentive Agreement was also discussed. It's basically a pact to push American investments into India.
हमारे बीच ट्रेड और निवेश में भी निरंतर विस्तार होता जा रहा है, यद्यपि ये हमारे पोटेंशियल से अभी बहुत कम है। मुझे विश्वास है कि हमारे बीच इंडिया यूएसए इन्वेस्टमेंट इंसेंटिव एग्रीमेंट से निवेश की दिशा में कॉन्क्रीट प्रगति दिखने को मिलेगी।
The second bilateral meeting of the day was between India and Australia. Prime Minister Modi met the newly elected Australian leader Anthony Albanese. This was their first official meeting. They talked about trade, about defense manufacturing, renewable energy, agricultural research, and ECTA. Now, what's ECTA? The Economic Cooperation Trade Agreement. It was signed when Scott Morrison was in power in Australia. Today, Modi and Albanese discussed ways to build on it further. So the message was quite clear. A change of guard will not affect India's ties with Australia. Next, Prime Minister Modi met 3 former Japanese Prime Ministers, Yoshihide Suga, Shinzo Abe, and Yoshihiro Mori. These meetings illustrate the goodwill and the personal chemistry that the Indian leader enjoys with these Japanese leaders. Interestingly, former Prime Minister Suga is part of a group of MPs called the Ganesh Group, an amorphous group of short-term members of parliament here, and this group is named after Lord Ganesh. In Japan, they call him Kangi Ten. It's a symbol of good fortune, just like it is in India, a solver of all problems. Prime Minister Modi is said to have appreciated Yoshihide Suga for this endeavour. He also invited the group to visit India, and this was followed by a meeting with the president of the Japan-India Association, that's Yoshihiro Mori. This association is a body to further India-Japan ties. It goes back to 1903. That's when it was established. During the Second World War, this group supported the Indian independence movement. Today, it helps build people-to-people ties and investment programs between the 2 countries. Then came the last bilateral of the day with the leader of the host country, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. Remember, India and Japan are celebrating the 70th anniversary of their bilateral ties. So this meeting was all about the road ahead, what can be expected, partnership in manufacturing, services, agriculture, ease of doing business, and digital technology infrastructure. And these 2 leaders described each other as indispensable partners who remain committed to each other's progress.
कि पोस्ट कोविड विश्व में भारत और जापान की पार्टनरशिप और अधिक महत्वपूर्ण हो गई है। हम डेमोक्रेसी, फ्रीडम और रूल ऑफ लॉ जैसे मूल्य साझा करते हैं जो हमें अपने द्विपक्षीय संबंधों को और गहन करने की प्रेरणा देते हैं.
That marks the end of Prime Minister Modi's whirlwind tour of Japan, his fifth visit to this country in the last 8 years. It shows how India remains committed to multilateralism while at the same time chalking its own path in the changing global order. Let's get back to the Quad Summit and the biggest headline from it, the launch of a maritime surveillance system. It is meant to track illegal fishing. It's called the IPMDA, or the Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness. Now, how does this work? How big is the problem of illegal fishing? How does the Quad plan to fix it? Which countries will benefit from it? Also, how has China reacted? We'll try to answer all of these questions one by one. Let's first try and understand how the system works. The IPMDA. It's a satellite-based tracking system. It connects existing surveillance infrastructure in Singapore, in India, and in the Pacific. And the idea is to track illegal fishing in this region. When I say the region, I mean the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific. Now, why illegal fishing? Why is it such a big deal? Because that's a new front that China has opened. 3.3 billion people around the world, almost half the world's population, depend on fish for protein. And China has become a threat to their food security. All because China wants to flex its muscle. It wants to showcase its supposed strategic influence on the high seas. And we'll get to that in a bit. What you must know at this moment is that China has been violating various economic zones. It's become a repeat offender. And some of you may be surprised to learn that China is responsible for 95% of the illegal fishing in the Indo-Pacific. 95%. What about the rest of the world? Well, China tops that list too. It is the world's worst offender. There's something called the IUU Fishing Index. It basically maps illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And this index puts China on top of the illegal fishing chart. Beijing is overseeing this fishy business. It has equipped its fishermen with the world's largest distant water fishing fleet, or what's called the DWF fleet, distant water fishing fleet. Some 17,000 vessels have spread themselves across the world, and these vessels are encroaching territorial waters. They're hunting for seafood, scooping the oceans of their resources. Reports say Chinese fishermen are overfishing in the Pacific, in South America, even in Western Africa. And this predatory fishing has become a global headache. It's impacting fish stocks and ocean resources. Fishermen around the world are suffering because of this. Even friendly countries like Argentina and Mexico are now raising an alarm. In the South China Sea and East China Sea, Philippines, Indonesia, they all say that China has been encroaching into their territorial waters. They say Chinese vessels are leaving nothing for the local fishing boats. In Sierra Leone, fishermen say Chinese fishing has affected their livelihood. Like I said, Chinese illegal fishing has become a global headache now. And the Quad is trying to solve this problem. This proposed system will be able to track illegal fishing boats, and it will be able to do so even if the vessels turn off their transponders, meaning even if they go off the radar. What happens once these vessels are identified? Now that is not clear. That plan of action has not been made public yet. Next question. Which countries will benefit from this initiative? Well, all, barring China obviously. Countries globally will benefit because overfishing, like I told you, is a global problem. We spoke about food security. Now let's look at livelihood. 60 million people the world over are engaged in fisheries and aquaculture sector. Every time a Chinese vessel overfishes or fishes in a country's territorial waters, it also hits the country's economy. According to one estimate, the economic loss from illegal fishing runs up to $20 billion every year. 20 billion. The US Coast Guard says this is a bigger maritime threat than piracy. Experts say the Quad's initiative to check illegal fishing and track dark ships will win support of most Southeast Asian countries, especially those countries which are engaged in territorial disputes with China, and there are many of those. Well, now that the announcement has been made, we'll have to see how these countries react. But what has China said? How has China reacted? What's its comment on this maritime surveillance initiative? Well, so far nothing, but it's safe to assume that a Chinese reaction is only a matter of time. After all, for Beijing, this fishy business is an integral part of its foreign policy. Because this is not just about fishing, it's about snooping too. China's distant water fishing fleet not only scoop the ocean of its resources, but also spread themselves across the world as a projection of Beijing's supposed strategic influence. Think of it like the imperial voyages. Reports say Chinese vessels have been bullying fishing boats of smaller nations, and history has ominous ends to such stories. The Quad is trying to check all of this. India, the United States, Japan, Australia, they're all reminding China about maritime boundaries, about the need to respect economic zones. This is the Quad checking Chinese expansionism and upholding a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Another Chinese policy is hurting the world. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy, it's disrupting supply chains, and along with the war in Ukraine, it's putting a lot of pressure on economies the world over. Inflation is setting new records. And here in Japan, it's no different, except that record is still pretty low. Japan has always been stuck with deflationary pressures, not inflationary. So much so that the Central Bank of Japan has been actively looking for higher inflation. You heard it right, and I know it sounds strange, but our next report will decode Japan's strange but long-standing financial policy where the government pushes for higher inflation. Our second day in Tokyo, and we wake up to this headline. Bank of Japan under pressure over inflation fears. Our first reaction was normal. Inflation is rising everywhere, so why not in Japan? But a few lines in, the article threw a curveball. Turns out Japan's record inflation is just 2%. Most countries would love 2% inflation. In America, it's 8.5%. In Britain, it's 9%. And in India, it's 7.8%. But then again, Japan is not like most countries. This is where the magic happens. This is the Bank of Japan, and it has a very interesting story and history. While the world over, central banks are working to hike interest rates to contain inflation, in Japan, the central bank has decided to keep interest rates stable, even if that means higher inflation. In fact, they're actively pursuing higher inflation in a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And the logic behind that is also very interesting. How do most companies respond to inflation? If raw materials are more expensive, they charge you more. They pin the inflation on you, the consumer, but not in Japan. Here, companies fear public backlash. So instead of raising prices, they cut down costs. In simple words, pay cuts. Workers in Japan are too docile to protest such decisions. Hikes, pay cuts, extra hours, most workers have the same reaction to all of it. So inflation in Japan triggers a weird chain reaction, one that ends with less money in your pocket, which means inflation ends with deflation. For decades, Japan has tried to correct this. Central banks kept interests low. Companies were urged to hike wages, but no luck. Japan's inflation remained stagnant, and along with it, Japanese wages. 2022 has finally granted Japan's long wish. Inflation has topped 2%. But as they say, be careful what you wish for. Because Japan may have wanted higher inflation, but not this kind. Japan's economy depends on exports, mostly cars and technology, and a big chunk of that goes to China. But Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy has meant bad news for Japanese exports. Just to give you an idea, in the first quarter of this year, Japanese exports to China have dropped by 22%. Then you have the US-backed sanctions against Russia. Japan has joined them. And that decision has come at a cost. The Japanese economy has shrunk by 1% in the first quarter. Another contraction, and the world's third largest economy will officially be in recession. The forecast is not good. Fuel and food prices are driving this inflation. If wages do not rise, Japanese families will find it hard to survive. But the central bank still won't budge. Their interest rates are still at near zero levels. And they have a justification too. Forced savings. That's what Japan is banking on. During the pandemic years, people cut down on spending. The hope is that money is saved up. By some estimates, Japan's forced savings could be around $156 billion. Should be enough to survive the war. But by then, Japan's economic recovery could stall. An aging population, tight Wuhan virus curbs, and falling exports. The perfect ingredients for a recession. With the WION team in Tokyo, this is Palki Sharma Upadhyay. How can we talk about Japan's economy and not mention robots? After all, they are the hardest workers here. They literally never get tired. Japan is often called the robot capital of the world. You can see robots doing all kinds of odd jobs here. Some are security guards, some are doctors, some are therapy experts. And I can predict your reaction. How weird is that? But in Japan, it's not weird at all. Humanoids are pretty common here. In fact, they're part of Japanese culture and religion even. Take a look. Meet Gakuten Soku. He was Japan's first humanoid robot. Around 3 meters high, big strange eyes, and a crown made of leaves. Weird, but not bad for 1928. 94 years later, Japan is a world leader in robotics. This city, Tokyo, is the robot capital. Here you will find robot cops, robot waiters, robot doctors, even robot therapy dogs. They say necessity is the mother of invention. And that's the story of robotics in Japan. You see, this country is struggling with an aging workforce. The average age is 49 years, which is the second highest in the world. So they're going to need replacements. And creating an entire generation of workers is not possible overnight. So Japan made robots. Currently, they have 300,000 robots in their workforce. That's 300,000 jobs being done by robots. It's 23% of the global robot population. In Tokyo, a robot is always around the corner. Like this guy, Asimo. He was unveiled by Honda almost 22 years back. But even today, he's got the moves. Asimo can sense moving objects. He can shake hands. Plus, he's not bad at football. Robots are not just workers for Japan, they're brand ambassadors. Asimo himself is a bit of a celebrity. He's played football with Barack Obama.
Hey, good job. I can do it more.
And even managed to sneak a smile out of Angela Merkel.
Daily basis. Our dream is to live with you, human, in your future.
Unlike in the West, Japan does not fear robots. There is no Terminator-style scare story. Instead, robots are treated as a special part of their culture, sort of like a national obsession. Behind me is proof of that obsession. This is Gundam the robot. He first appeared in a television series in 1979. He's more than 20 meters tall, and right now he's in unicorn mode, which means that this is the friendly version of him. Now, any pop enthusiast in Japan will tell you that robots are a part of their culture. Astro Boy, Gundam, they're all part of daily life, and experts believe that this has to do with religion as well. The biggest religion in Japan is Shintoism, and they believe that everything has a life. Mountains, rocks, rivers, perhaps even robots. Gundam is a fan favorite in Japan. He sold 50 television series, movies, manga, and video games. But the big prize is this one, the Gundam toy models. 90% of plastic figurines sold in Japan are of Gundam. Another fan favorite is Astro Boy, a young robot with human emotions. The Japanese grow up reading these comics. They see heroes in robots. So for them, interacting with the humanoid is nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, it's a privilege. Toys aside, even the real ones are in high demand. During the pandemic, most people tried to avoid physical contact, so robots were the natural answer. They're efficient, they work non-stop, and they cannot catch the Wuhan virus. In 2010, Japan's robotics industry was worth around 1 trillion yen. That's around $7 billion. By 2035, it is expected to reach 10 trillion yen, or $70 billion. The question is, how will that journey pan out? Outside Japan, robots are still viewed with concern. They use industrial robots, but not humanoid ones. Blame Arnold Schwarzenegger or big tech. The fact is, robots are yet to be normalized outside Japan. But within the country, their future is safe. Because Japan is not fond of foreign workers, they prefer to keep their society and culture closed. The result is this: more robots, less immigration. As more countries opt for closed borders, automation may be the only answer. And if that happens, Japan is in pole position to take advantage. With the WION team in Tokyo, this is Palki Sharma Upadhyay. There is, however, another side to the story. Not every job can be done by a robot. Some require emotions, maybe a personal touch. But in Japan, even such jobs are being delegated to robots. Take therapy, for instance. Many nursing centers in Tokyo use robots. We visited one such facility. At first we thought, what a novel idea, proof of Japan's technological prowess. But once we reached there, we changed our mind. Because some of what we saw was heartbreaking. You see, not every question has an automated answer, especially when real human lives are at stake. "84-year-old Nomoto Takeo is used to this routine. He sits motionless in his wheelchair, shoulders drooping, hands clasped, but his face betraying a sense of amusement. Takeo's eyes peer intently into the creature in front of him. It sounds like a dog, it behaves like a dog, yet it isn't real. He's a computer with nuts and bolts. One of the many robots that work here at the Shintomi Nursing Center. This place is known for robot therapy. We visited the center when one such android session was underway. Pepper was leading it. His probing questions are supposed to sharpen your mind, stimulate your senses. Like many before us, that's what we came to see. How tech-savvy Japan is harnessing robots to care for its elderly. But these pictures distracted us. What we saw wasn't the triumph of technology. It was the loss of humanity. More than a dozen elderly Japanese live here. For them, these lifeless animals are a source of joy. They pet them like you would a real dog. They hold out their hands, desperate for the warmth of anything living. But cold metal is all they feel. Sure, the robots dazzle you. Their nimble joints, their thick fur, all of it makes them seem almost real. The key word being almost. At the end of the day, these are lifeless bots running on batteries. They don't have emotions. They have protocols.
Robots that watch over the elderly are widely used in Japan. This equipment monitors the heartbeat and vital data of elderly people 24 hours a day. There are devices that watch over the elderly with images 24 hours a day.
Do these people realize they're petting a robot? Or does the difference not matter to them anymore? Neither scenario reflects well on Japan. This is a country where 30% of the population is over 65 years of age. Many of them live in nursing homes like this one, ignored by their children, loved by lifeless androids. How can Japan escape this demographic slide? Perhaps with some compassion. This year, a Japanese film released at the Cannes Film Festival. It's called Plan 75. The story is dark and disturbing. It said that every individual above the age of 75 signs a deal with the government. They receive a sum of money, and in return they agree to be euthanized, what we call mercy killing. This apparently is being held up as a solution to an aging population. It may be hard to imagine now, But these people were once the backbone of Japan's economy. They were probably doctors or engineers. But today they live in isolation, petting robots and coddling fake dogs. It's a symptom of Japan's loneliness pandemic, a side effect of the aging demographic. With the WION team in Tokyo, this is Palki Sharma Upadhyay. With that, let's take a look at what else is making news across the world. This is Gravitas Global Headlines.
Cash-strapped Sri Lanka sharply hiked fuel prices to a record high, causing further pain to the country's 22 million people during its worst economic crisis since independence. 3 people were killed in Yemen's capital, Sana'a, after Houthi forces downed what they claimed was a spy drone of the Saudi-led military coalition. PTI chairman Imran Khan remains defiant as the Shehbaz Sharif government blocks former Prime Minister's planned protest march to Islamabad on May 25th, claiming it is to create unrest in the country. Kharkiv's subway system resumed on Tuesday, 3 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. Residents in the Ukrainian city were forced to take shelter in metro stations across Kharkiv as Russian forces shelled the city. A Ukrainian counteroffensive has pushed them back far from the city. Russia's parliament to consider scrapping the upper age limit of 40 for signing up to join the army, in a signal that Moscow may be looking to recruit more troops for the Ukraine war. A Moscow court has rejected jailed Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny's appeal against a 9-year prison sentence. Navalny and his allies condemned the verdict as politically motivated. At least 10 people have been killed after an under-construction building collapsed in southwestern Iran. At least 39 people were injured and dozens were trapped. Thousands of Indonesians have been forced to evacuate as tidal floods hit the Indonesian city of Semarang. No casualties have been reported. Jason Tatum played a starring role with 31 points as the Boston Celtics thrashed Miami Heat 102-82 to draw level in the NBA's Eastern Conference Finals. The Celtics were without the league's Defensive Player of the Year Marcus Smart, but rode a blistering start to make it 2-2 in the best-of-7 series. World number 2 Daniil Medvedev eased into the French Open's second round after beating Argentina's 103rd ranked Facundo Bagnis 6-2, 6-2, 6-2. The Russian showed no signs of discomfort from his recent hernia operation and notched up his maiden clay court win of 2022 in 1 hour and 38 minutes.
Time for a wrap. We'll be coming to you tomorrow with Gravitas Tokyo edition with a new set of stories from the Japanese capital, leaving you as always with Gravitas Images. Thanks very much for watching.
Tenemos a Batman y Robin Company. Batman y Robin siguen a la... Se cayó la competidora. El carrito por los 102 aniversarios. Los y salimos y tenemos a 3 maravillosos. Puro.